I consider myself third generation Los Angeles. Like my dad's father came to Los Angeles right after the San Francisco earthquake, where he had been residing at the time. My mom went to manual arts, but grew up in Boyle Heights, and they moved out to like 27th and Hoover around mid-30s. And my dad's old uptown, like Normandy and Olympic, and he went to High. So the reason why I was born in Cincinnati, he was doing his pediatric residency there.
Right, right. And then left pretty soon thereafter, right?
So, and then we drove across the country, jumped on a boat, and he became pediatrician in charge of for the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission. We were based in Nagasaki.
That's got to be had to have been a hardcore experience.
For my father, it was very, he was a combat veteran of the Second World War. He was captured at the Battle of the Bulge. If a reader has read the first 50 pages of Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, they were in the same division. And so in the early part of Vonnegut's novel, very closely parallels my father's experience.
Did they know one another? Did your father have any?
No, 10,000 people in the division.
You can tell I've never served in the military. I'm assuming everybody knows everybody. But Battle of the Bulge was obviously a kind of famous, infamous battle, and that was hardcore.
Yeah, so he was a prisoner of war from December of 44 to April of 45, and for the first 2.5 months of that, he was listed missing in action. So his parents, my mother, had no idea if he was dead or alive.
Wow! And then they find out. That must have been a harrowing couple of months for your mom.
It was, and she was pregnant with a brother who was born with a birth defect, congenital heart disease, and so her husband's missing. Her first child is born with severe birth defects, and he did not survive for very long, and so it was an extremely tough time for my mother.
Wow! Oh, and she had earlier in her life difficult times, like around mid-century in the internment camps. She was a senior at UCLA, you write, or you say, I guess, in this book, and was sent off to camp before she could graduate.
That's correct. And so so like for all these over 100,000 Japanese Americans and their parents who were not citizens, were incarcerated in these concentration camps scattered all over the American West.
And into this world, you were born in what, 1940?
49.
49. And you grow up in Van Nuys?
So 2 years in Nagasaki, and then when we returned, my dad found a house in Van Nuys, but that itself became an issue. He was teaching at the time at the kind of just emerging UCLA Medical School, and it's as well as having his own practice. And one of his colleagues at UCLA Medical School was selling their house, and my father wanted to buy it. This was in Van Nuys, and this colleague came back to my parents a little bit later and saying, "Well, I can't sell you the house, Jim." His name was James Yamazaki, and my father asked why. He says, "Well, the neighbors are not happy that and are not welcoming to a Japanese American." So my dad put on his uniform and literally knocked on every door on the block and said, "I'm the guy who wants to buy this house. Do you have a problem with that?" And nobody would own up to it.
I love that. I mean, this is a veteran of World War II who was like a prisoner of war, Battle of the Bulge. I think.
Yeah, he had a line of combat ribbons and just in its personal decorations and so. But because of that, he never really felt comfortable there. And so, my mom liked that house a lot, and developed some relationships with the neighbors, but my dad never really felt comfortable there.
Well, it's interesting to me to note, as I was reading this book, that for a man who has spent his life in literature, You were not a good student.
I was a terrible student. I was, so for a middle-class Japanese American coming out of the Second World War, and just, it was so traumatic for, I would say, the whole community. You know, they dealt with that trauma in different ways. The way my mother dealt with was to try to kind of erase all appearances of otherness. And so, for example, is that I didn't learn how to use chopsticks until I was about 10, just because she wanted us to appear assimilated as much as possible.
Yeah, I know that. I've heard similar stories on my dad's side. My dad's father came from Sicily, his family did, and none of them were taught Italian for that reason, even though it was spoken by the elders. You know, it wasn't passed down because they didn't want the kids to speak Italian. They wanted them to speak English.
Very similar.
And you loved the Dodgers, like any good young boy in Los Angeles, I would imagine. But that was also what? That was the time of Jackie Robinson.
Well, Jackie had already retired then, but like my dad was a Brooklyn Dodgers fan because he was really understood what race and class meant in American culture, and he understood what a big deal it was for Jackie Robinson to break the color line in Major League Baseball. And so from that point on, he was a Dodgers fan. And when they came west, he took me to the first game in the Coliseum against the San Francisco Giants, in which the Dodgers lost. And but that was still, it was a big moment for me to step out into like a Major League Baseball diamond. And the Coliseum was kind of famously eccentric in terms of its layout. And
I was going to say, I was trying to imagine a baseball game there. It's hard to see how it all fit.
Yeah, the left field was like, I think, 270, and they had this huge screen. And there was a left fielder, Wally Moon, who was known for being able to develop a swing that can get over that screen, and they were called moonshots.
And so you grow up, you know, rooting for the Dodgers, living in LA. You're a Boy Scout?
Very much so.
And that was formative for you. Like, that really had an impact.
It was very formative. It was just, part of it is that I went to Birmingham junior high school and high school. So it was the last, and perhaps it was rare that it was from 7th to 12th grade. So it was like a huge school with, like, you know, a wide range of ages and development. And so, but there were so few people of color there. And I think I was at that, for the majority of the time there, I was the only Japanese American. I don't recollect any African Americans in this student body of close to 5,000, you know, a handful of Chicanos. And so it was difficult to fit in, or just didn't, as much as my parents and my mother in particular tried to kind of create good middle-class American kids. But I was never a good student. I wasn't even that good of a reader. But the Boy Scouts kind of, because our troop, and I forget the number of it, was basically the outcast from about 5 different junior high schools around the San Fernando Valley. So just kind of, we're very much like one of those Hollywood World War II films where you had, you know, where the platoon was a wide cross section of American culture, excepting for race. But it's, so we had the juvenile delinquents, we had the rich kids, but we were all kind of social outcasts, whatever schools that we were in.
So it was a refuge.
It was very much a refuge, and we were very fortunate to have a tremendous scoutmaster who really taught us kind of campcraft really well. And so taking those long walks, that's one of the reasons why I stayed for so many years, you know, into high school. We'd take long walks through the Sierras. The longest one was about 110, 115 miles.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's a big walk. And how did this, you talk in the book a little bit about how the experiences that you had as a Boy Scout have kind of carried through your life and have helped you even professionally in terms of how you approach your job. Can you talk about that?
Yes, I mean, part of the campcraft was to be able to, what Mr. Gilbert, the scoutmaster's name was Mr. Gilbert. He was a member of the Los Angeles Police Department. He wanted us to be able to move in the outdoors independently, and that if we chose to do that, and to have the campcraft skills to do that safely. And so when we took these long walks, for example, he would allow us to walk independently if we chose to. And I learned how to, and one, enjoy the solitude. That was the first sense of being able to kind of like be out in the wilderness, whether it's in the Sierras or closer in, and to kind of like enjoy that stillness, and to be able to kind of like independently take what you saw two-dimensionally on the map, and then match that to the actual world, and then back and forth with those things. So that gave, and the reason why that's important for me as a bookseller is that you're able to kind of create mental maps of your particular store, in my case, City Lights, and that it's, so when we go about selecting books, having that mental map, be able to kind of move between a two-dimensional world on the map, and also now with the added element of like kind of digital files, and looking at like how we measure sections and all that. I have a very good sense of like how the store looks. I've through the pandemic, I've worked mostly remotely, right here from the front porch of our house.
Are you close to the store? I'm just curious. Like, you live right there in the city, or?
We live in the city. I'm about 5 miles from the store, and because of my own personal health issues, I don't go in very much. And so I communicate with the staff via phone. If there's particular spatial issues, I'll have them take pictures of a snapshot of whatever section that we're kind of thinking about that we need to rearrange or whatever.
So you moved to San Francisco in August of 1967. Seems like an opportune time to move to San Francisco. Can you talk about your arrival in the city and what it was like then?
I'm so fortunate. I mean, just like, as you could probably imagine, as the listeners can probably imagine, somebody who was a Boy Scout through high school was probably not, well, I could just say bluntly, I was probably one of the squarest kids in all of California. And it's
yeah, a Boy Scout moving to San Francisco. Is that the summer of love, I think? I mean,
it was just like I hit San Francisco late August. So just as the so-called summer of love is kind of winding down, I'm walking down H Street in the London fog jacket with a button-down shirt, wearing wingtips, and just kind of marveling at kind of like, this is very different from Van Nuys.
Yeah, I'll say. And there's a period, I guess you get there in August of 1967. You don't start at City Lights until the spring of 1970. And you got the job either while incarcerated or shortly after being released from prison. Is that right?
Still incarcerated.
Okay. Can you talk about that? Because that's a unique way to, that's a unique trajectory to get a job.
It certainly is. And for somebody who is not a good student, and not even a particularly good or adventurous reader. So how that came about, I was very politically active, in that it's 1967. The war in Vietnam is getting increasingly violent for the people of Southeast Asia, and as well as for all the Americans who are getting drafted. And so even though being culturally and politically unaware, despite my parents' best efforts, any young man at that point would have to start becoming aware, and you have a series of decisions to make. And so I was so fortunate to be in San Francisco at that time, being surrounded by it and being in the epicenter of kind of political and cultural change, which it was almost impossible not to become swept up in that in a very short period of time. And just tell this short story. So I'm walking through San Francisco. A young person hands me a leaflet, and it's a benefit for the Black Panthers. I don't know who the Black Panthers are. It's, you know, it's a screening of Battle of Algiers, but it sounded interesting to me, and so I've always been curious, and so I decided to go to this thing. And so an incredibly unsophisticated, I guess I was 18 at that point, standing in the same room with David Hilliard, who was the chief of staff of the Black Panthers at that time, you know, really close to Huey and Bobby. They were not in the room, but it's and a lot of other members of the Panthers. And to see this remarkable film and to hear what the Panthers were attempting to do out of, you know, people who had been in the party from its origins, was the beginning of a remarkable political education. And at the same time, I'm in San Francisco for just a few months. The Stop the Draft demonstrations at the Oakland Induction Center are taking place. I'm living in the dorms at San Francisco State, so I take a bus out there to Oakland for the first time early in the morning, and was a witness and participant, even though I didn't know what I was doing, to kind of one of the first major shutting down of a city and of an induction center on the West Coast. So it was a significant moment for me, and then to be aware that I was part of something much larger, and that a lot of people were having to make similar decisions and try to how they're going to conduct themselves. So that's a long way of, from that point forward, I became more and more politically engaged and was running into more and more people who were helping to educate me about practice and what to read, and to get a little historical background to what I was attempting to understand and do at that point. And you
ended up running afoul of the law at some point, right?
I was arrested at the Oakland Induction Center, and I was a student at San Francisco State. San Francisco State had been at the center of radical educational reform led by students and professors, in the sense that a lot of the activists of color were going out into their particular communities, whereas the African American or the Latino communities or the Asian communities, and working with educators and young people, high school students, and preparing them to enter college, and even just to kind of get college as part of your horizon, that you can do this. And they had built kind of a really multi-year thing so you're just not throwing young people into an environment that they hadn't expected, that there was about a year and a half of preparation. And so that was really determined effort, and it's why we got so much support in the strike from the community. So the San Francisco State Third World Liberation Front, which I was a part of, had a lot of these constituent organizations, like the Black Student Union, who was like one of the major organizers of the strike. The strike lasted for over 6 months. I think it's still the longest student strike in American history. And as a result of that, the first College of Ethnic Studies was formed. Many of us were arrested. I was arrested a couple different times, and then as a consequence of that, sentenced to 2 6-month concurrent sentences in San Francisco County Jail. And that led, one of my colleagues was a poet named Francis Oka. He was a colleague, a friend, and a mentor. Francis wasn't that much older, but he was so much wiser and was kind of, even when I was in jail, he'd come to visit me on a regular basis, and you know, when he could afford to, would put some change in my commissary fund. And but he went to Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who's the owner and founder of City Lights, and Shig Morao, who's a Japanese American who was also a manager and a partner of Lawrence's. Shig had become so crucial to City Lights that Lawrence made him a partner just off of Shig's sweat equity. So there was no investment on Shig's part, but he became really crucial to that. And Shig was actually the bookseller who was arrested when Howe was kind of attempted to be banned, and Lawrence and Shig were put on trial for selling obscene literature, which they eventually won. But it was Shig who was actually sitting behind the counter, and when the police came in to arrest somebody, it was Shig who got arrested.
And you show up, I mean, Lawrence Ferlinghetti hires you right out of prison on Francis's recommendation, correct?
So, sight unseen, I get out after about, I'm not exactly sure whether it was 100 or 120 days that I actually ended up serving. Saw my parents for a weekend and came back up and started working for City Lights. And I don't think Lawrence or myself expected that I would be there 54 years later.
I mean, that's quite a run.
Yes.
And I want to talk a bit about City Lights. I think most of my listeners will be well familiar with it. Many of them will have been inside the store. It's a destination at this point for people who are visiting San Francisco. But I want to place it geographically, and I want to hear you as a lifelong San Franciscan now to kind of give an overview of City Lights and where it sits in the city at 261 Columbus Avenue and the intersection of communities and neighborhoods that it serves.
No, that's well put. I think we have to go back to 1953 and when Lawrence and Peter Martin first opened the store. So at that point, City Lights is literally at the intersection between three communities. To the north of us is the Italian community, and to the south of us is the Chinese community, and to the east of us is kind of the international district that was populated by seamen, migrant workers, itinerant people of all sorts. And so it was both an entertainment district, a district where cheap rooms could be had for kind of all, whether they were seamen or migrant laborers. And and so there was all these various cultures interacting with each other. And because we're just at the beginning of the impact of the GI Bill, and Italian families and Chinese families in particular in the neighborhood were starting to move to the outer districts, and whether it's the Sunset District or the Richmond District or the Outer Mission, and so residential places that had once been densely packed, were some of these people were now moving, and so there were cheap rents to be had, and that's how it became affordable for a lot of artists and young people. So even when I get there many years later in 1970, I was able to be within 10 minutes of City Lights walking, and for $90 a month. Young people today think that's some sort of science fiction, and I understand.
I was going to say, this all sounds like a dream. Like artists can live in San Francisco and, be near City Lights and North Beach and all that kind of stuff. Like that was a different era.
It was so Peter Martin had a small literary journal called City Lights, named after the Charles Chaplin film. He had published some of Lawrence's translations of French poets, but they had never met. And Lawrence is also a painter, and he had a studio near the waterfront. And as he was just happened to be driving up Columbus, which is the street that City Lights is on, and he saw this guy hanging a sign saying bookseller. And so Lawrence was curious, and he parked his car, walked across the street. That was Peter Martin, who had decided that he would open a bookstore as well as run the journal. And Lawrence and Peter had a brief conversation. They both Lawrence invested $500 to match Peter's initial investment. And that was the beginning of City Lights for an investment of $1,000. And 71 years later, we're still rolling.
I mean, it's unbelievable. And it was a very small store at its outset. I want to say it was like 350 square feet or something. It was like a room.
I think that's pretty accurate. So the other thing, as we cast ourselves back to 1953, there were some very good independent bookstores in San Francisco that existed at that time, mostly in the downtown area, but they're also aspirationally upper middle class and not that welcoming to scruffy bohemians, whether they're writers or painters or just readers. And most of these contemporaries of Lawrence's generally did not have enough money for hardcover, and so most of the bookstores at that time carried hardcovers. Paperbacks were considered something for the drugstore and were very down market from the upper middle class point of view. And Lawrence and Peter both wanted to open a bookstore that was major focus was contemplation, and that if somebody chose to buy something, that was good. But the transaction was not the major point. Lawrence held on to that through his entire life, and it's obviously we got a little bit better on the business end of the things, but but I think it's still a really important point of what we do at City Lights is to provide the space and the books for people to sit and contemplate and kind of ruminate that, and if they choose to buy it, that's wonderful. But it became an immediate gathering spot for these younger writers and artists that were living throughout San Francisco, and particularly in North Beach. So Lawrence always describes it as once we opened our doors, we could hardly close them. And so for a long time, Shig would close the store at 2 a.m. We would stay open later if Shig was in an engrossing conversation. And so for my first years there, I worked part-time for close to a decade, closing Friday, Saturday, Sunday nights at 2 a.m.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And when you started there, what was your role? Because I think your role probably evolved over the years.
Yeah, so when I first started there, I actually didn't work in the bookstore. I was the packer for City Lights Publishing, and they had an office a couple blocks away up on Grant Avenue. And that's where I worked primarily. I would cover shifts sometimes in the store if the store was shorthanded, but my primary job was to take many copies of Howell or Kaddish or Lawrence's poems and pack them into boxes and send them to bookstores around the country.
So you say in the book, when it comes to, you mentioned Kaddish and you mentioned Howell, the Allen Ginsberg poems, which, Howell became a legal issue, and the selling of it, the publication of it became, as you mentioned earlier, like there was an arrest. Seems crazy. It seems crazy, but I suppose, it shouldn't seem too crazy considering. But you say in the book that the Beats were not necessarily your favorite. And what you say is, quote, what distanced me from the beats was politics, which were mostly white. And I should also say mostly male. Like the beats were a very manly tribe. Not necessarily, I guess that there were some women involved too, but you always think of Kerouac, Ginsberg, Burroughs, Corso. I'm sure I'm missing someone, but it's mostly white guys.
For the most part, I mean, just Amiri Baraka, Ted Jones, Bob Kaufman, but we're part of those social circles. Ted and Amiri in New York, and in those days he was known as Leroy Jones. The women were always important, but like so much of history, not just the literary history, women get written out of history, people of color get written out of history. And there's been scholarship and people like Diane DePrima and Joanne Kiger who've been insistent on the acknowledgement of what their contributions and so many of their women contemporaries did to all that. Lawrence's own kind of, he had deep respect for Gary Snyder and Allen Ginsberg. He felt that the beat label was too narrow and too ahistorical, and he connected himself to a literary tradition that he thought the beats were, but that went hundreds of years back. That would include, Blake and Poe, and just kind of and as well as Rimbaud and Baudelaire, and just so he identified with a greater, much wider thing. And so we can think of Langston Hughes' metaphor of the river, and that's how Lawrence thought about kind of where his placement in literature and his interest in literature were. This kind of a text that could be also resistant to things as they are, and also at the same time provide a horizon of what's possible.
Well, what you're speaking of, it's sort of like the ethos of City Lights. And that's guided largely by Lawrence, but also by others who work there, including yourself. And something that I couldn't help but underline as I was reading the book is this line where you say, people are surprised by the fact that we don't carry most current bestsellers. We could sell many copies, but from our perspective, they are not consistent with our values. That is anti-capitalist, right? I mean, this impulse to put books on the shelves that don't necessarily hew to market indicators.
And it's also our faith in the reader. That how we think of City Lights as a portal to a gorgeous room that has been previously not seen by the individual. And so we see ourselves as kind of a portal of discovery where that the reader is invited in to kind of to be a little initially disoriented because they're not seeing what they may have come in for looking for, but that they will discover other elements. And Lawrence and Shig and Peter very deeply believed in that, and it's something that I witnessed through my whole career, is that to trust the reader and not to kind of have expectations or try to place books for a particular audience or a particular kind of what this might be current or hot is something that we don't need to do. I think I view it as a real privilege to be part of developing that trust and to see how we're rewarded. And that's one of the things that booksellers, one of our privileges is that on a daily basis, we get to see the delight of discovery, and that in the same way that writers and editors and publishers don't have that direct contact. And so they're the creators of that work, but we're the ones who get rewarded to see the delight of the individual reader as they pick that up. And And it's always really gratifying when a reader comes back and really thanks us for kind of, putting on their doorstep. We were talking earlier about John Keane, and just like and for readers to discover punks or counter narratives is like kind of a hugely rewarding, to have somebody come back and says, thank you so much for that. It was an amazing book and it's an amazing writer. And we're going to follow John Keane whatever he's going to be coming forward with.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think what you're talking about, at least in part, is curation. A curation of like the visual and spatial experience of being in the store in terms of how books are shelved, but obviously also which books are shelved. And you're not looking at bestseller lists necessarily to guide your choices. And I think that City Lights as a business, what is it now? How many years old is it now? I don't even...
71.
Say again?
71.
Okay, so 71 years this bookstore has been going, which is extraordinary for any business. I have to believe that you would consider part of its success the careful curation and the attention to this part of the business. It has served your customers well. I think it's a little bit counterintuitive. I think most people from the outside looking in would say, yeah, just put the latest bestsellers up on the front table, and that's what people want. And that's actually not what they want.
It's being able to not to try to tie people to expectations, but just to kind of to credit their kind of openness and curiosity. As it's not just City Lights, but places like SO1 and Book Soup and Skylight all practice the same ethos. So when you walk into either one of those stores, just like, I'm always delighted when I'm walking in there. And Book Soup, in days when like Glenn and Tosh were running it, it's just like I was always, because they always had stacks of books all over the place, and I was always discovering something I hadn't seen or hadn't thought of in the same way that they were doing it. And so I was always knocking over piles of books because they would have them stacked in the aisles there.
Well, I think like one of the things that your book reminded me of or clarified for me is the decision-making process that goes into stocking a bookstore, like the inventory question. There are decisions that have to be made, especially when square footage is limited. I get like if you're in a big, huge like box, Barnes and Noble or something that's like 30,000 square feet, there's more latitude. But even there, decisions are made about what to stock. And
that's exactly correct.
You consider, I want to say 50,000 titles in any given year?
Something like that. There's no precise figures that even... Yeah, there's no industry kind of standard. I mean, hundreds of thousands of ISBNs are issued each year, but how many actual books are produced? But roughly, I'm looking at about 50,000 pieces of catalog copy, making decisions out of that and saying, so the majority of my job is to say no.
Sure. And I want to say you can only carry 33,000 titles at this point at City Lights, something like that.
When we max out, it's about, so currently it's about 27. But yeah, we max out at about 33,000 titles and 2,100 square feet. So we're really densely packed, and it's, we arrange books in a unusual manner. So one of the things that makes City Lights is that the staff is, all my colleagues, until the pandemic, were deeply involved in the selection process. We're trying to refigure that out. So one of the things that's happened in the business is that print catalogs are now, for the most part, history. A lot of younger booksellers have never seen a print catalog of new titles, whether it's from a small publishing house or Random House or University of California Press. And so the delight of a printed catalog has now been transformed to these digital catalogs. There's one standard operating thing that's called Edelweiss, and that's probably preferable than every publisher trying to develop their own kind of digital catalog. But it is not as edifying as looking at a print catalog. So it makes it more difficult, and you didn't really have to educate any bookseller to how to flip through a catalog and annotate it for themselves. And then but so for decades, I would distribute the new titles catalogs to the staff. They would have, a week to 10 days to go through those, and I would get these back and then to try to make both curatorial and physical sense out of our kind of extended conversation of what we were excited about and what would be the best titles for us to present.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a question that a lot of my listeners might be having, is like how booksellers make decisions about what to stock. I mean, a lot of it is just the personality of the individual store and the people who work there. It's what you're personally responding to as a reader, but there are limits, right? Because it can't just be a bookstore can't just be a pure reflection of your personal taste.
Oh, that's absolutely correct. I mean, the bookstore is a reflection of, at the very least, aspirational on our parts. It's like, even though in any given year we're taking in 6,000 to 8,000 new titles, even with a dedicated group of 12 really tremendous booksellers on the City Lights staff, we're only going to read a small portion of those 6,000 to 8,000 titles, much less all the backlist over the centuries that we haven't read yet, and in most cases we'll never get to in many lifetimes. But it is having the conversation with other booksellers, with the publisher reps, and in City Lights' case, in my case, a really crucial aspect of how we select books is to ask the question, if there's a book in our hands that we really love, how did that book get to us? And as you find the answer to that, you generally lead you back to the acquiring editor and getting a sense of what a particular editor does well. Becomes a tremendous tool that it makes having that as. So over the years, I've been able to develop a large database of what editors have acquired, and so you could kind of anticipate a writer because of who the acquiring editor is, and Tommy Orange would be a perfect example. Tommy's editor, Jordan Pavlin, as over a long period of time, has been a tremendously resonant editor for City Lights, and so before even reading a page of there is, we were excited because this was something that Jordan had brought forth to us, and so there's a long list of editors that create that. So it really provides a strong foundation for the titles that we take in, and it makes us seem smarter than we actually are, to have that basis, and it makes us look more prescient than we actually are. But it really is kind of understanding what editors do, or particular publishing houses, and so it's not just the big corporate houses of New York, but it's like the Grey Wolves and the Copper Canyons, and there's like the just all over the country. There's really interesting presses, and like we're just talking about John Keane earlier, and that's Song Cave. It's a small publisher, but it's so finely tuned that just it's those are the kinds of presses that anything they publish, City Lights will take, because we have such faith in their taste. I've never met these people, but we know their books and we love their books, and it's.
Well, but I think what you're talking about is human beings. There's a personal connection, and there's a human side to this. And I go through something of the same thing when I'm deciding on the booking of this show. Certain titles come from certain editors that I know it's going to be good because I have such faith in their taste. And I don't think that the average person out there might be aware of this fact, that booksellers are tuned into editors, and often, I guess, will have a relationship with an editor even if they've met them before. And that can be a crucial factor in the decision-making process. And it also leads to good decisions, right? I mean, it helps you make good decisions when you have such faith and awareness of what a particular editor, like what their taste is and what they tend, the quality of work that they tend to put out. And it's worth noting too that especially at these bigger presses, like the big five in New York, there are lots of editors working under one umbrella, and they're not all created equally, right? They don't all have taste that you necessarily vibe with. So having awareness of those individual human beings and the way that they do their job is crucial. And I think it's unseen. I don't think that gets a lot of airtime. We don't often hear about the relationship between editors and booksellers. It's usually editors and authors, right?
Yes.
But booksellers are tuned into who the editors are.
Well, you have two groups of people, booksellers and editors, who our major role is to remain invisible, to have no barriers between the writer and the reader, or as few as possible. And so oftentimes that reticence, the necessary professional reticence, also melds with the personality. And so sometimes, or oftentimes, because of that reticence, that they're not reaching out. And so I hope that I and my colleague Rick Simonson at Elliott Bay in Seattle, I guess we've been known for over these many years that that's what Paul and Rick do, that they ask that and then they knock on doors. And that's actually how I got to know Rick initially, is that we found ourselves asking similar questions and knocking on the same doors. And, but for both of us, it really is kind of what key to our decision-making process. And it's really gratifying to me to see other booksellers adopting that and finding equal pleasure and success in that.
Well, and also I think there is a responsibility incumbent upon a bookseller to know the community that they serve, to be aware of the people who are coming in and out of the store on a day-to-day basis, and making sure that the titles that are stocked on the shelves are reflective of that. And there was a line in the book, I'm going to paraphrase it and probably badly, but it struck me, where you were talking about wanting to make sure that I think it was a certain title was stocked, or a certain set of titles were stocked, because if they weren't, like, you could see somebody coming into the store and looking around and not seeing those titles there and just thinking, well, this isn't a serious bookstore, and that's not going to be the same for every customer. There are going to be some customers who walk in wanting to see certain things, and other customers who want to see certain other things. It is your job to sort of have your antenna up for those things.
Yeah, and I think the way we do it at City Lights is really just kind of to focus on literary and critical excellence, and that's where, once again, where the trust in the reader comes. That if we provide access to titles that are harder to find, just that people will discover them and not just discover, but be delighted by their discovery. And so it's one of the reasons why we do have sections of the store that what we're trying to do is incite conversations with the books. Like there's a section that we called Topographies and Soma Logistics, which is an attempt to kind of put books from political science, sociology, geography, and to be able to, and psychology, to be able to kind of look, how does place affect the interaction of the individual and larger social grouping. So you could find Mike Davis in that section, you could find Jane Jacobs in that section, you could find Rebecca Solnit in that section. And so and so a more conventional sections, those authors might be in different sections. And it's
well, it's interesting to think about the impact of that. Because again, I think most of us walk through a bookstore and we sort of take it at face value. We look at the books and we see which ones are next to which books are next to which books. But that placement is something that you take seriously. Like I think there's a line in the book where you're talking about how the books, as they exist in the physical space of a store on the shelf or sitting out on a table, are in conversation with one another.
We feel very strongly about that, and to keep shifting focus and and to be able to feature authors in an atypical way, and sometimes it's just the serendipity. Like right now, 3 of my favorite authors are Julie Otsuka, Helen Oyemi, and Ruth Ozeki, but they also happen to be immediately adjacent to each other in the alphabet.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's just pure, but it is. We feature those authors, and it's in a way that you probably won't see in most bookstores, and we're rewarded by readers gravitating to them. There's 3 of our best-selling authors in our contemporary fiction sections, and it's whether it's by happenstance or deliberate kind of creating opportunities for the books to be in conversation, and then to have that conversation engage a reader. And so we think long and hard about that. It involves a lot of conversation with the staff. We invite the staff to create pop-up sections. So we keep little spaces in the store, like, if a member of the staff wants to feature a particular publisher, they're welcome to do that. We have what we ask them to do. If they're like, let's say they're going to feature Dorothy, which is an astounding press out of St. Louis that features 20th century and 21st century women authors. That is their particular mission, is to highlight authors that may have been neglected or on the cutting edge of things. So they'll do their best-selling book for City Lights is the collected works of Lenore Carrington, but they're also publishing people like Renee Gladman, just on the cutting edges of both poetry and fiction. And so one of my colleagues featured that. And so what we asked them to do is to reach out directly to Dorothy, get a statement of purpose from them that we can then print and put on a banner in front of that section. And so it helps bring readers to understanding of what a particular vision of a publisher is. They're just not random books, but that's an individual editor and publisher that has a very specific vision and, in our opinion, a very beautiful vision. And those pop-up sections are really popular. I mean, and it gives my younger colleagues an opportunity to kind of stretch out into the literary world and develop their own connections.
Well, I think for the customer, I love those sections. Like, I want to be told when something is great. You know what I'm saying? I want somebody to be enthusiastic and to want to share something and to have done the work of curation for me. And I think that's common, right? That's got to be the typical response by most customers. There's a lot to sort through. Like you were saying, the tens of thousands of books or hundreds of thousands get an ISBN number every year. It's a lot to sort. So
yes,
the work that you're doing is vital in helping to kind of sift through it all. And I'm curious, but before we part company, to hear your thoughts on the future of books. We've just seen small press distribution shut down, which is a big loss for small presses and has caused a lot of consternation among writers in that space and editors who run small presses. And I would imagine for booksellers who, like you, are interested in finding the esoteric and in sort of, locating presses like Dorothy and titles by these smaller operations that are deserving of a wider audience. Can you just talk about where things are and where you think things are headed?
In a purely literary sense, I'm very, very optimistic. I think there's so much good writing coming from so many writers from so many different backgrounds being published by such a wide variety of presses. Yes, the big Manhattan, the Knopf and Scribners are doing some wonderful work, but so is presses like Charco and Flower Song. So in a strictly textual sense, it's tremendously exciting to be a bookseller and reader right now. But in a structural sense, as we look at the loss of SPD, which was the last remaining kind of slender thread for so many, more than 350 small independent publishers were distributed through SPD, and they had no other means. And so just because they're small doesn't mean that they don't have tremendous literary significance. It's like we were just talking about John Keane earlier, and Song Cave and his book Punks. SPD was the only channel that existed to get that book when Keane won the National Book Award. So it's how we're going to deal with that. That's probably something that I won't have an answer for a long time. But the simple fact is, not just City Lights, but most bookstores don't have the operational bandwidth to have individual relationships with like 350 different publishers. And so if we're able to do 10 or 15%, that would be a lot. So the loss is unimaginable, and that's going to, and the impact will be seen over a long period of time. But if we don't find a solution to that, that will have really negative implications for all these independent presses and authors and the readers who are interested in exploring that work, and make the life of booksellers much, much more difficult.
I feel like someone's got to fill that void. I have to believe there's somebody out there plotting to create a business to help fill the void.
There are, like, Asterism out of Seattle is the one kind of bright spot right now. They're doing some very interesting work, and presses like Ugly Duckling, who had been at SPD, had moved over there before the collapse of SPD, but it's still not going to be able to provide all the Asterism as they develop will probably be able to absorb at best 20% of the presses of that SPD was representing. And so there's discussion right now, but the margins for a distributor or wholesaler are so enormously thin that it's not a realistic business proposition. It would take some form of philanthropy to be able to recreate what had done, and even at that point, it's still we've been aware for a long time that to have only SBD was really an incredibly fragile, and there was always that risk, and the fact that independent distributors like Consortium and PGW over the last 15 years have been bought by Ingram, and so right now distribution is one of the key choke points for how books are going to get to readers, or even into our hands as booksellers.
I was going to say, I mean, it makes your job, like you say, a lot harder when you have to go to 350 different small presses rather than go to one place. Impossible. So can you talk as well about how or if the job has changed, the job of being a bookseller over the course of your career? Like, I would imagine a lot of the fundamentals remain the same, but maybe not. Like, have things shifted in significant ways?
No, you're absolutely correct, Brad. The fundamentals are absolutely the same. It's the conversation, the reading, the curiosity. Those remain the same. Through my 50 plus years as a bookseller, there's always challenges. Whether the big box stores, whether it's Amazon, or the death of print, and the electronic book, or just. But what we're finding is that there's a group of younger booksellers who are opening stores and have a really very strong sense of the challenges that they're taking on. It's not kind of a blind idealism. They understand how difficult this is as a business proposition, and we're seeing it in. I was just in New York at 3 really excellent stores, but there's a store up in Washington Heights, the northern end of Manhattan, called Word Up, that started as a volunteer project 13 years ago. So it's a primarily working class and Latino community. It's also a community that's had deep and rich history. But it's also a community that had not had that many bookstores in the past. And these literary activists have, it's both an organizing project and a project of passion, and also it's become one of those key educational tools where they now have a paid staff, and there's young people of color who are learning different aspects about the book business and taking advantage of their position in being in New York City to be able to have conversations with publishers in the big houses. And so they're getting this wide scope of knowledge and bringing that back to their particular community, and have created a wonderful bookstore. And so things like that give one a lot of optimism. I mean, the challenges are always going to be there, and hopefully we'll be able to find a solution to the distribution issue that we've been talking about. And what we see at City Lights is the intense curiosity of younger readers, and so it's not an aging population in that sense. It's continually renewing and curious in different ways that I learn a lot from by engaging with some of these younger readers and booksellers. So I think it's challenging, but also very exciting.
What do you think makes a great bookseller?
Curiosity and the ability to channel that curiosity into detailed, consistent work. I mean, most of what much of what we do as booksellers is really being detail oriented, and it's in the same way that a musician will spend hours and hours of kind of working on their scales, working on various technical aspects, so that when they do perform, is that they can be free. And so the booksellers are much the same in the sense that a lot of the fundamental work that we do is very detailed oriented, but you always have to be curious, and you have not to be afraid to seem ignorant, because we're all ignorant about something, and it's always to be kind of wanting to open that next door. And but I think those are the key aspects, that curiosity translating into hard, consistent, detailed work.
Well, what I found in my experience with booksellers is that they often take a lot of pride in their ability to matchmake.
Yes.
And some of them are, I mean, that's what I think a great bookseller does oftentimes, is they're so good at pairing a customer with a particular book. And for me, often has been the case that they share with me a book that I didn't even realize I was ready for. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, there's an anticipatory factor where they can kind of like get a sense of your taste and pair you with a book that might be a couple steps ahead of where you currently are. Do you know what I'm saying? Or they take you.
Absolutely. I think I have some great bookseller friends who are really, really astounding on that. It's almost like, that they're able to mind meld and be able to see not just what the current interest is of the reader, but what the possibilities are for that particular reader. Right. That's not a particular strength of mine, but I do admire highly, like, friends who have that ability.
Yeah, I mean, it's fun. I mean, I like that just as like a civilian, when I get to match somebody with a book that they love. That's it's particularly satisfying. And I have to, before I let you go, ask you about the time that Toni Morrison bummed a cigarette from you, because I feel like this has got to be one of the great stories of your life, great literary stories anyway.
I've been incredibly fortunate, and there's a lot of things that we could critique the book business on, but one of the things that should be lauded is kind of the horizontal nature and of its generosity. That, yes, there are obvious hierarchies within the business, but there's also kind of the horizontal would be how curiosity binds different people, from different stations within publishing. So I can't think of many other cultural endeavors where a retailer like myself can pick up the telephone to the head of, let's say, Knopf. So when Sonny Maeda was alive, so the story is that I became acquainted with Sonny Maeda. I would see him on a regular basis in New York. He was the editor-in-chief and publisher of Knopf for many, many years. A brilliant, brilliant publisher, editor, and a great, in my opinion, a great human being, a person to have great conversations. And it wasn't just me that if he was curious about what we did as booksellers, and his door was always open to any bookseller. It wasn't just like Rick and myself, and just all you had to do was kind of have the temerity to call Sonny up. So I smoked cigarettes in those days. Sonny was also a smoker, and so we'd be at these publishing dinners, and he would catch my eye as he was going out, just to say, "I'm going for a smoke." And so I'd often go out there with him, and we're actually at a convention in Los Angeles. Sonny caught my eye. We went out for smoke, and a few moments later, Toni Morrison walks through the door and greeted Sonny and asked me if I could have one of my cigarettes. And I fumbled it out. It was a signal moment. I was able to kind of like not drop the cigarettes and not kind of drop the lighter, but I was able to have a moment sitting on the streets of Los Angeles, smoking with Sonny Maeda and Toni Morrison. It was like kind of astounding.
Do you remember the conversation?
We were just talking. I think we were talking about Cormac McCarthy, and just and kind of marveling at how well Cormac was doing in terms of sales. So, like, Cormac's first several books were within the book industry noted for kind of like the astounding writing and the incredible lack of sales.
Right.
And it was Sonny and Gary Fisketjon who really believed so deeply in Cormac's work that they made a huge effort to bring him to a larger public, and they were, as we all know, incredibly successful. That Toni Morrison, that also why that conversation was resonating with her, and because she was also for many, many years an editor, like, for Leon Forrest, Tony Cade Bombara, Henry Dumas were all among some of the authors that she published. And so she was really aware of kind of how difficult and it was sometimes to bring authors to a larger audience, but how important it was to maintain that belief and to have to work with an author over a long period of time. And so one of the things that is now more difficult for editors, because I think the quality of editors is as good as it's ever been, but the difficulties in corporate houses are more difficult. So it's much harder for an editor today to work over a long period of time with an author that's not reaching so-called commercial success or sales success, and to develop that over a long period of time. And so it's and so they were kind of commenting on, like, how rewarding it was when you were able to break through, and how fortunate they were as kind of working at a publishing period where it was somewhat easier for them to do. And then, like, Sonny as being the head of the house, how carefully he protected his editors and nurtured them into those types of relationships.
Yeah, I mean, I remember reading, I think it was when Cormac McCarthy passed away, there were a lot of summations of his life and work and career and obituaries and everything else. And I remember kind of marveling at the arc of his career and the way that he was able to fail commercially over and over again in ways that I don't think, to me, it felt like antiquated almost. Like, wow, this doesn't really happen very much anymore, if at all, where a big house will take on an author like that and just keep the faith, you know what I'm saying, over many books that don't hit the mark, even though they might be critically acclaimed and beloved by other writers and that sort of thing. But to have publishers or a publisher or an editor stick with somebody like that is, man, it does not happen.
It's much more difficult now.
But that's what you guys were talking about as you smoke cigarettes. Where was this? And what year? I'm trying to place this in time. If McCarthy was having sales, this had to have been after All the Pretty Horses, or
yes,
the 90s, I guess it would have been.
If Rick Simonson was here, he's has such a precise memory of when particular conventions and where they were, but somewhere it would be in the 90s, probably the latter half. And it's because Toni was there as an author, but I forget which book that we were celebrating at that point.
Yeah. What kind of cigarettes were you smoking? I'm just curious.
American Spirits.
American Spirits. Okay. that's the healthy cigarette, right? Well, listen, it has been super fun to get a chance to speak with you and to hear your story and to hear some of the insights that you've accrued over a long career in books and in book selling. It's not a conversation that I have had enough of on this show, and I hope to do more of it. It's an honor to have you, and I thank you for the time, and I wish you well.
Oh, Brad, thank you so much for having me on this kind of wonderful conversation and for reading the book. And I really, really appreciate all the attention that you focused on the book and myself. So thank you very much.